Wyatt Staples rechecked his systems for the seventh time in a row in an attempt to quell the nervousness that coursed through his veins. Equally so, the fire in him burned brightly for the same reason. Cold and warmth to different forces that collided within him until only that familiar, welcoming, sometimes gentle, sometimes strenuous focus would eventually remain once the chaos of battle started. All systems checked. No deviations or errors were detected, the AI announced once again, his only company as he flew closely to the Noir Navio alongside the rest of his fellow pilots. The wing had been reduced to a little over half its original strength, from 80 fighters to now only 54. The technicians and mechanics had done everything in their power within their limited window of opportunity. 14 fighters had been deemed too damaged to serve another mission so soon properly. The rest had been restocked, checked, and finally given the green light to be manned. And now here he was, minutes away from another battle against the beings he hated more than anything. His armored fingers danced over his controls, and with a simple command, one of his screens presented to him what the external cameras were seeing. Off in the distance, zoomed in, he could see the cattle ship slowly spinning in place. Moving its focus to the side, the smaller figure of a cruiser, the almond-like shaped ship that was Commander Redford's first objective. It wouldn't be much longer before it detected them. Out of reflex, Wyatt shifted the camera's attention to the Nornavio, just in time, too, as he witnessed the bays opening to reveal the 8 plasma cannons, 4 at each side of the ship. Unlike the black exterior of the Nornavio, the cannons had an opaque yellow color across their surface. They stood out against the ship's hull in a beautiful contrast that was soon joined by the heavy laser turrets and the railguns. The laser turrets were enormous, a single long, thick barrel that promised death. Much like the railguns, though placed closer to the ship's center, 2 turrets were located on the top and 2 on the bottom, 1 on each side. The missile pods also came out. Though smaller compared to the other weaponry, they were located closer to the stern, lined up in 2 groups of 4. Finally, the PD turrets, all 50 of them, were scattered across the hull of the ship in what at first glance would look like a haphazard distribution. But after seeing them in action, they created a bubble of death that could defend the Noir Navio effectively from any direction. The torpedo launchers were located at the bow of the ship. That only left the most deadly weapon at their disposal, the spinal-mounted pulse beam cannon. After his limited experience commanding the deadly assault destroyer, he was more than aware that missing was not an option. The pulse beam cannon was meant to be either a decapitating first strike or a finishing blow. It would need at least half an hour before it could be fired again. "We can't afford to miss if we want to survive," Wyatt muttered weakly. Already his sensors could detect a quick buildup of energy coming from the Nornavio. As much as he hated the Drazan, their jammers were inadvertently helping them in that regard. Thanks to what information he was able to scrounge up in the past, he knew the Drazan were not immune to their own jamming effects. They could only significantly diminish their effect. He didn't understand the science and mathematics beyond how the jammers worked. All he knew was that it worked similarly to the scanners, but in reverse. Both required a tremendous amount of energy, so only big capital ships, at least cruisers, could mount them. Most scanners were relegated to large stations or habitats for that same reason, where the scanners worked by creating small FTL ripples across the hyperluminical dimension to detect pretty much anything on a small corridor and see their movements practically without time lag. The jammers disrupted whatever the hyperluminical dimension was in small ways. The Drazan, through the use of their jammers, were able to disrupt the electromagnetic laws in subtle ways in a large area. It made communication basically impossible at long ranges, and sensors had their range vastly reduced. And unlike scanners, which due to their constant focus alerted anything capable of detecting warp signatures to know they were being watched, jammers didn't give their location away right away. It was a brutish form of stealth, but one that worked well and gave them a significant advantage in combat against any conventional enemy. The Noir Navio wasn't. Staring at his screen, he marveled at the now fully armed and prepared black ship, ready to deliver a devastating alpha strike upon the murderous, wretched Drazan. Outwardly, he could only imagine what Commander Redford was going through. Internally, a tinge of envy touched his heart, but he shook his head a second later. Focusing on the task at hand, he noticed that the heat signatures of the Navio suddenly spiked, and a blue light appeared at the ship's bow. The time had arrived, and he clutched his controllers tightly. "Burn, burn, burn," he muttered through clenched teeth. A second later, a beam of superheated particles erupted forward, but not alone. The railguns too fired, each firing against different targets. A swarm of missiles was let loose as every pod launched missiles as fast as the system could reload them. The heavy laser turrets and the plasma cannons remained silent, the former out of necessity, and the latter because it needed to be close to its objective. Wyatt switched the view of his external camera just in time to see the pulse beam impact the shields of the Drazen cruiser, lightening up in an almost blinding spectacle as the ship's shields were pushed to their absolute limits in a futile attempt to withstand the devastating assault. The shield glowed brightly, then they were gone faster than his eyes could perceive. A second later, the cruiser was pierced and gutted. Commander Redford had aimed for their center, where their main deck would be located. The blue beam of light died off, revealing a gaping hole on the cruiser's hull that exited on the other side. The pilot had only a moment to smile before the cruiser was beset by several internal explosions that ended in a powerful detonation that created a small star that illuminated the dark side of the planet, floating peacefully behind the accursed cattle ship. The response was immediate as his sensors picked up more details, its strength severely reduced in but an instant. Now he could see the Drazen's movements. The remaining cruiser and the 8 destroyers moved in response to the aggression, taken entirely by surprise. 2 of the railgun shots missed their mark by a fraction of a second, but the other 2 hit, pummeling against the shields of 2 destroyers. Fighters began to pour out of the remaining cruiser, quickly adopting attack formations now that the Navio had been detected. Commander Redford's decision to sacrifice stealth for more firepower was a risky one, but given their circumstances, it was their only viable option if they wanted to end the conflict as quickly as possible. It made sense to him, too. Sure, the Navio could have struck against the cruiser and run away, trying to remain hidden as it slowly vented out the heat generated by the spinal mount. In theory, that was the more sensible option and a feasible one, too, since the Navio was faster than the Drazen ships, but that would only end up playing in the Drazen's favor. But a single fighter maintaining visual confirmation of the Navio could easily ruin its stealth capabilities. More importantly, however, if the damage done to the cattle ship's systems were repaired, there was no telling what the Drazen would do then. Losing that ship over a protracted battle and a constant chase that could last days was something they couldn't afford. He wanted secure that damn ship as much as Clara did, that was for certain. As much as he disliked headstrong assaults, he recognized the need for them in such circumstances. Suddenly, his sensors detected something that froze his blood for a moment. The cruiser, the destroyers, and the 4 frigates were launching missiles without stopping. In just 10 seconds, over 2,000 missiles were flying toward the Navio, with more following. Of course, the Navio's swarms of missiles continued to pour out, all of them well underway toward their objectives. The shields of the Navio lit up across several sections, easily withholding laser fire coming from the Drazen ships. 2 torpedoes were launched, aimed at the cattle ship itself. The railguns kept firing, scoring more hits as the distance between the 2 opposing sides closed with each passing second. To him, every moment that passed was a mere flash before his eyes as the PD turrets began to fire. Scores of explosions illuminated the darkness of the void as missiles that threatened the Navio were destroyed. Across the blackness, the Drazen did the same. But in both cases, not all missiles could be stopped. Several impacted invisible space before they could touch the ship's hull, momentarily glowing with an intense azure color at the center of impact. A lonesome destroyer was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of missiles, flickering out its shields before 2 railgun shots pierced it. Seeing an opening, 2 heavy laser turrets shifted their focus to it. The sides of the turret glowed with an intense violet color, and while he couldn't see it with his own eyes, his sensors picked up the focused beams that tore the starboard side of the claw-shaped destroyer, melting its hull and cutting through bulkheads, though it wasn't enough to kill it. A frigate wasn't so lucky, as missiles took away its shields only for the other 2 heavy laser turrets to bisect it, turning it into lifeless hunks of metal. Now it was the Noir Navio's turn to feel the sting of railgun strikes, with a dozen focused impacts that put its double-layer shielding to the test. Commander Redford replied to the gesture in kind, with 3 railgun strikes impacting another destroyer. 2 ruptured its weakened shields, and the third hit its engines, shearing off one of them clean with an explosion that made the destroyer tumble for a moment. Wyatt focused on it. "Everyone, target the destroyer designated D2. Alpha Wedge, ready your tactical mines. Everyone else, clear the way and aim for their PD turrets," he ordered, while already burning fast for their designated target. Nornavio Bridge. Redford Kalin frowned deeply, gritting his teeth as his attention was divided across several possible objectives. Over 500 fighters were burning fast and would be within PD range in less than a minute. Already, laser and kinetic PDs were at top performance trying to decimate the incoming missiles. For every dozen that were destroyed, 1 got through, and there were so many that it was frankly ridiculous. With a mere thought, he noticed that the 2 torpedoes currently heading toward the shipyard came to life, burning at max speed. In the span of only 10 seconds, the railguns fired again, a shot missed, 2 impacted against the remaining active cruiser, and the last one hit another frigate, nearly depleting its shields. He focused for a moment on the heavily wounded destroyer and thought it would run away or move to a more advantageous position. Instead of playing into his plans, however, the destroyer charged in, firing its remaining railgun, laser, and particle cannons with murderous intent. Cursing internally, he aimed the port plasma cannons and unleashed a full barrage against it. The plasma bolts traveled quickly, not quite as fast as a railgun shot, but at their current distances it mattered little. The cannons fired once every 2 seconds, and though many of the shots missed their mark, the wounded, suicidal destroyer cared not for its own safety. With every impact, the plasma bolt detonated against the ship's hull, tearing and melting huge chunks of it only to allow another bolt of plasma to strike deeper with even more devastating consequences. The Drazan vessel was dead by the time Redford's attention was taken by the 2 frigates moving to intercept the second wave of torpedoes he'd launched not too long ago. With concentrated fire, the 2 frigates were able to knock the torpedo's shields down and pierce its heavily armored head. A great detonation was triggered as the antimatter warhead was punctured far earlier than he'd predicted it would. The Drazan were apex predators through and through, and it showed in their tactics and strategies. For all their arrogance and sense of superiority above all other species, they worked together as a unit to achieve a singular goal. They never argued or fought amongst each other, but that was as much a strength as it was a weakness. They were vulnerable to surprise attacks as they could not comprehend the idea of someone else hunting them or preparing for an unseen foe. Who would even dare do such a thing? But if allowed to dictate the flow of any encounter, be it on space or ground, then there was little anyone could do against them without holding a significant advantage over them. He had used his advantage to its fullest potential given the circumstances, and as far as he knew how to employ it, so now he had to end this quickly. "First shield at 71%, second shield is at 92% and holding," announced a specialist. "Reroute power to shields, engines, and weapons. Minimal life support," Redford replied, and took a moment to think before continuing. "Once the fighters enter the effective range of our PD turrets, focus on them. Ignore the missiles. I don't want a single mine to go off." "Sir, but they're missiles," Galt questioned worriedly. Redford understood his worry, but now was not the time to be cautious. "Our shields can handle them. If the fighters manage to deplete our shields, we're dead," he said, as he gave the mental command that shifted the Noir Navio's course slightly, just enough to dodge a volley of railgun strikes. At the same time, it put him in the perfect position to fire his starboard plasma cannons and heavy laser turrets to unleash their wrath against another destroyer. "Understood, sir," replied Galt as he carried out the commander's orders. Seconds before the fighters arrived, they all fired their missiles to act as a curtain, a cunning tactic, but one that he was ready for. Several missiles were fired at the curtain, detonating in their midst and clearing most of it in an instant. PD turrets shifted their focus to the arriving fighters, focusing entirely on them, and 4 of the missile pods joined in, looking to deplete their shields or outright destroy every single one of them. Tens of fighters were destroyed with each passing moment. easy prey that the superior targeting the Noir Navio possessed was ready to claim. In exchange for focusing on one danger, the barrage of Drazan missiles struck the shield unchallenged. "First shield at 59% and dropping quickly," announced another specialist. Redford remained as collected as he could, firing all railguns at the cruiser as it changed trajectory, revealing a collection of particle cannons. It fired, and a second later every shot impacted, but the railgun shots hit their mark, finally depleting the shields of the monstrosity. "Hard turn to starboard," Redford ordered, and the entire ship seemed to groan as the dampeners worked overtime to keep everyone from fainting or worse. With a mere thought, his order was carried, and 2 more torpedoes were launched directly at the cruiser. It was soon followed by a barrage of missiles that quickly flew past the torpedoes, covering its advance. Some fighters turned around in hot pursuit of the torpedoes. Shifting his attention to the crippled destroyer, he saw his fighters peeling away from it. A few moments later, and while trading shots with 3 destroyers at the same time, Redford watched the destroyer, D2, turn into debris thanks to well-placed tactical mines. His momentary joy didn't last long as his third wave of torpedoes was destroyed. A few Drazan fighters had sacrificed themselves in order to stop them. Suppressing a wave of frustration, he focused his attention on another wounded destroyer. Unleashing the heavy laser turrets, all 4 of them gutted the claw-shaped ship until another brief, miniature star illuminated the darkness of the void. "First shield at 23%. Second layer is at 80%. Drazan fighters eliminated, shifting targeting to missiles. Drazan frigates have destroyed the remaining torpedo before it could reach their objective. Drazan cruiser has us locked in. They're firing again." 5 remaining cruisers, 3 frigates, and the cruiser still remained, and he was starting to feel the strain of commanding such a powerful vessel creep into his mind. Regardless, his task was not yet done. But why haven't any of them moved to intercept the first torpedoes? The shipyard is of no strategic value as it is now, but the docked cruiser should be... What are they planning? He thought worriedly. Pushing his concerns aside, he took quick notice of his fighters and saw, with great delight, that with no enemy fighters near to protect the damaged frigates, they were now going after them. The lonesome frigate would be their first target, or so he thought, but much to his surprise, only 2 squadrons moved against it. The composters were leading the rest against the other 2. Simultaneously, he fired 2 railguns at the nearest destroyer and fired a barrage of plasma fire against the cruiser, happily pummeling his shields with railgun, particle, and laser fire. The shields won't hold out for much longer. If I were commanding a battlecruiser set against these same enemies, I would have lost in half the time under this amount of firepower. Then again, if I were commanding a standard battlecruiser, I wouldn't have considered assaulting the Drazan in the first place, he thought grimly, as he watched with satisfaction the power signatures of the destroyer dying off quickly, reduced to a crippled, drifting hulk. The cruiser proved to be a much tougher target, and while the plasma barrage was doing damage, the 3-kilometer-long, kilometer-and-a-half-wide ship had enough armor to simply absorb the damage and keep firing undisturbed. Suddenly, as he was about to fire on the cruiser once more, the signals of his first torpedoes went out. He didn't need to guess that the 2 other destroyers were responsible and were rushing to aid their brethren. "Missile ammunition at half capacity across all pods. We're burning through them too quickly." "Heat sinks all across the ship are reaching their maximum capacity. We're now well above the recommended battle-approved limitations. Commander, the first shield has been shattered. The second layer is at 62% capacity and dropping." Redford winced as a painful shock coursed through his mind. He felt the shield die before the officer made the announcement. He, too, could feel a gradual but intense heat spreading across the entirety of the Noir Navio's interior, threatening to suffocate, burn, and cook everyone aboard if the temperature kept rising past the limits the heat sinks could provide. For a brief moment, the aged commander considered the option to retreat, to flee in disgrace from the enemy, but by doing so, ensure the survival of Clara and everyone on board. He had her blessing and permission. There would be no shame in fleeing. Undeterred and ignoring such thoughts, he pressed on. He could still see the possibility of victory at hand. With a thought, the Noir Navio made another turn, this time adjusting its angle to face the cruiser head-on. With great fury and determined to bring his enemy down, All weapons fired upon the cruiser, while the PD turrets struck down scores of missiles now coming from every conceivable direction. The heavy lasers scarred its hull, the railguns pierced through several bulkheads, but failed to hit anything vital. The plasma bolts struck with great impacts while digging into the ship's entrails, and finally, amidst the chaos, 2 more torpedoes were unleashed, their thrusters burning at full capacity from the start. No bold strategy was needed this time. No underhanded tactic, no unusual approach. The Noir Navio made a hard turn upward and then to port, moving as quickly as possible away from the cruiser that too late realized what was going to happen. It tried to take down the torpedoes, but several of its particle cannons and railguns were now ruins alongside. Its available PD turrets lacked the firepower to chew through the shields and armor, and its only viable weapon, their favored laser turrets, wouldn't be able to deplete their shields in time. The cruiser fired its retro thrusters and tried to veer off, but it didn't work. It was of no matter, for the result would be the same. The torpedoes made their mark within moments, easily passing through its many gaping wounds. Then, a huge detonation erased the cruiser from existence in a cloud of pure energy. With its death, the jamming came to an abrupt end. Redford let out a breath of relaxation as the strain on his mind diminished considerably now that the ship's sensors and communication arrays were restored to normal. But the battle wasn't over yet. Seemingly distressed by the destruction of their last remaining active cruiser, the destroyer staggered long enough for him to adjust his vector approach and fire another barrage of missiles and railgun strikes. The railguns struck instantly now that the destroyers were within effective range, scoring another kill as the reactor was punctured and went critical. That shook the remaining 3 destroyers out of their stupor, firing their weapons and calling for retribution. "Gah!" Redford exclaimed, gritting his teeth as the shield was impacted by a barrage of railgun strikes and particle fire that finally took it down. The shock had been far more intense than he thought it would, but the pain passed quickly. A quick inquiry revealed that the Noir Navio's shields had been severely depleted by the cruiser's last assault, and the shock wave of its cataclysmic destruction punished it further. It had been just a momentary respite, and it cost him dearly. "Commander!" Galt and several others cried out, worried. "Keep firing! Keep firing! Destroy the remaining ships!" Redford cried out as several impacts tore apart the outer hull of the Noir Navio. To him, it registered as nothing more than a numb, hollow sensation, but it was there. Its reinforced titanium armor provided spectacular protection, while its nano-enhanced carbon polymer ensured that while damage would be taken, it would be minimized as much as possible. "Taking damage, sir! Our bulkheads are holding, but they won't be able to withstand any concentrated fire for much longer," someone announced, but he paid it no mind. He had 3 destroyers to kill before the 2 remaining destroyers arrived within range. Already they were launching missiles, but with their numbers lessened and ammunition severely depleted, they were now only a nuisance. Checking the heat skins, he made a split-second decision to unleash a final full barrage of plasma cannons and heavy laser fire upon 2 of the remaining destroyers. It wasn't a difficult task, as the 3 of them were now on a suicidal run, attempting to ram themselves into his ship. If there were any doubts before, they were gone now. The cattle ship was too important for them, enough to willingly sacrifice themselves if need be in order to protect it. The first destroyer, already heavily wounded by railgun strikes and several holes left by missile explosions, was turned into a drifting hulk as it was struck by several plasma bolts. The second destroyer was unable to resist the focused fire of all heavy laser turrets aimed at its center. There were a series of explosions, and the ship split in half, each part drifting in different directions. But the Noir Navio didn't come out unscathed. "Deck 22B has been breached. Lockdown is in effect. Deck 3C has been destroyed. No survivors detected. Multiple hull breaches and fires detected across decks 6 to 9. Superior starboard heavy laser turret destroyed. I repeat, superior starboard heavy laser turret destroyed. PD turrets 4, 17, 22, 23, 25, 31, 37, 45, and 49 have been destroyed." With a thought, Redford fired all railguns at the remaining destroyer, puncturing it without remorse. The ship didn't explode, but as its power signature died out, he could now focus on the coming 2 destroyers. Just then, He remembered the frigates and checked his sensors to discover that they were no more and that 52 out of the 52 fighters that left were still alive. Opening a link with Wyatt, he spoke. "Report, Lieutenant."
Sir, we were able to destroy the frigates. Some of our fighters suffered minor to considerable damage, but no casualties or heavy injuries are reported.
Wyatt paused for a moment.
Commander, shall we engage the remaining destroyers in harassing maneuvers?
Negative. Do you have enough mines and missiles to deliver a Staplian assault? Redford asked.
Staplian assault?
Wyatt asked, confused. I'm still coming up with a name for it. Since you were the one who came up with it, it is only proper that you receive recognition for it. I had my doubts that it could work in real combat. Operation Weed Whacker proved it can be incredibly effective, Redford replied, and before Wyatt could protest, he continued. Now do you?
We have enough for 7, Commander. 3 haywire and 4 tactical mines are at our... Wait, Commander, something's happening to the cattle ship,
Wyatt warned. Borrowing a still intact external camera, Redford focused on the cattle ship and found that, indeed, something was happening. There was a small series of explosions that tore apart what used to be sealed doors. Out of the new gaping hole, though, a swarm of fighters, dozens of bombers, and 20 gunships flew out, their thrusters pushing their pilots to their limits as they had a single objective to reach, the Noir Navio. There was a moment of silence across the entire bridge as they stared in horror at what was coming for them. Over 1,000 fighters, 112 bombers, and 20 gunships, all of them with the sole intention of destroying them utterly. Redford waged his options, and he didn't like any. He had less than 25% missile stock left, the heat sinks were near full capacity, and the intense heat was present even on the bridge, which meant that it was worse everywhere. The shields were still recharging, and while they could provide limited protection as they were now, it wouldn't be enough to withstand so many small foes all at once, and even if they could, the destroyers would finish them off. He was without conventional options at his disposal, so he did the only logical thing he could think of at that moment. "Wyatt, do you have any ideas?"
Just one, Commander,
Wyatt replied, unafraid and strong as titanium.
We could deploy every available mining drone.
Mining drones? Redford asked himself, intrigued. Some pirates and rebel groups had been able to use mining lasers as weapons in the past. Potent and effective, but not viable in the long run. Mining lasers were powerful, they needed to be, but they lacked the refinement to be true military-grade weapons. Their effective range was the problem, but up close they could be devastating. Mining drones would make for subpar fighters, he commented, but not as a rebuke, as he too wanted to know what his heterochromatic second was thinking about. A second later, Redford could hear and feel the wicked smile that formed on Wyatt's lips before he replied.
What if we use them as shields?